You share a bed, a mortgage, and a calendar, yet you have never felt more alone. After 20 years, I love you often turns into, did you lock the back door? The grand declarations quietly retire. The deep conversations thin out. And somewhere between the third decade and the fourth, the two of you stop being a couple having a conversation and become a household having a logistics meeting. You are not enemies. You are not even unhappy exactly. You are just no longer curious about each other. And that absence of curiosity is one of the loneliest feelings available inside a marriage. Today we are talking about the 5 silent language barriers that transform long-term intimacy into a cold, functional business partnership. Not because knowing them guarantees a fix, but because you cannot begin to change what you cannot yet name. The architecture of functional shorthand. It begins so gradually that you do not notice it happening. In the early years, you ask questions because you genuinely did not know the answers. You wanted to understand how they thought about things, what they feared, what they dreamed about. The texture of their inner life was interesting to you in a way that made ordinary conversations feel like discoveries. And then, incrementally, the questions stopped, not because the relationship failed, but because it succeeded in a certain narrow way. You learned each other. You built a shared vocabulary of references and habits and preferences. And that knowledge, which felt like intimacy, began to function as a substitute for it. The operational intimacy trap works like this. The more familiar you become with someone, the less you feel the need to ask them about themselves. You already know how they take their coffee. You already know what they think about the neighbors. You already know, before they speak, what position they will take on most topics. So instead of asking, you predict, and instead of listening, you wait to be proven right. This is not malice. It is efficiency, the natural drift of two people who have shared a life. The problem is that the shared language stops growing. The emotional vocabulary shrinks down to logistics and schedules, and the deeper register, the one that carries vulnerability and genuine interest in who the other person is becoming, goes quiet. You are not less in love, necessarily. You have just stopped being interested. And that loss happens so slowly, you might not register it until the house is very quiet one evening and you realize you have nothing to say to the person across from you that you have not already said. The prediction barrier and the loss of curiosity. The second language barrier is closely related to the first, but it operates at a specific, identifiable moment. The moment one of you begins to speak about something that matters, and the other is already composing their response before the sentence is finished. Long-term partners develop predictive models of each other. You have heard enough of their thinking that you can anticipate the shape of what they are about to say. And because you can anticipate it, you begin to process it before it arrives, classifying it, sometimes dismissing it before the actual words have been spoken. This is the prediction barrier. In practice, it means your partner is not speaking to you, they are speaking to a model of themselves that you built inside your head. And the model is almost never fully accurate. The model is the person they were 2 years ago, at the moment you last updated it. The actual person who has continued to change and has new angles on things they have discussed before, is speaking into a gap between who they are and who you have decided they are. The women who notice this describe it in similar terms. The feeling that there is no point finishing the sentence because the response is already waiting. The feeling that they have become inside the marriage, someone predictable, and that to be predictable is to have become invisible. The dialect of unspoken grief. Every long marriage contains things that were never said, not secrets necessarily, but disappointments that were swallowed rather than voiced, hopes that arrived and quietly departed without acknowledgement, moments of loneliness that were managed rather than shared, versions of the future that were silently given up. Over decades, these unsaid things accumulate. They do not disappear. They settle into the texture of the relationship as a kind of background static, a low-level frequency of grief that both people carry, but that neither has a language for, because to name it would require admitting how long it has been building. The dialect of unspoken grief expresses itself in signals rather than words, in the sigh that carries more than it appears to, in the particular quality of silence after a comment that landed wrong, in the way one person leaves the room at a certain moment, or the way a topic is consistently steered around without anyone acknowledging that it is being avoided. Partners in long marriages become fluent in each other's silence, in a way that is sometimes profound and sometimes simply a way of not having to talk about the things that would be hard to say. The grief stays encoded. The sighs accumulate. And because neither person speaks the underlying disappointment directly, it cannot be addressed. It can only be managed, around and around, in the same unresolved loop. Partners often grieve separately, in parallel, without ever making contact across the divide. She grieves the closeness they had in the early years. He grieves the version of himself that felt capable and needed. Neither knows what the other is mourning, because neither has said it out loud. And so they move through the same house, grieving alone, in a shared silence that feels, from the inside, like being the only person in the world. The translation gap in high-stakes conflict. When things do come to a head, when one of those buried disappointments finally surfaces, when the accumulated static reaches a pitch that cannot be managed, the conversation that follows is often startling in its failure to make contact. This is the translation gap. The moment when you say one thing and your partner hears an entirely different thing, not because either of you is being dishonest, but because the words arrive preloaded with decades of context that the other person cannot see. You never listened to me is not, in most cases, a literal claim about the current conversation. It is a summary of a feeling that has been building for years, the feeling of speaking and not being heard, of the prediction barrier, of the unspoken grief that has never found language. But your partner hears it as an accusation about right now, and so they defend right now, rather than addressing the years behind the sentence and the conversation, which could have been a breakthrough, becomes another loop. The translation gap is also where historical baggage does its most damage. A minor request, will you put the phone down when I am talking to you, carries, in a long marriage, the weight of every time that request went unheeded, every time the phone took precedence, every time the small dismissal accumulated into something larger. The person asking hears all of that history in the request. The person receiving it hears only the surface. This is why long-married couples often find themselves in arguments that feel disproportionate to the apparent trigger. The argument is never really about what it appears to be about. It is about the translation gap between what was meant and what was heard, stretched across 20 or 30 years of a shared language that has quietly diverged. Rebuilding fluency and breaking the silence. None of this is irreversible, But reversing it requires something that long-term relationships often resist: the willingness to be a beginner again. The beginner's mind, the quality of approaching a familiar person as if they might surprise you, is the antidote to the prediction barrier. It requires the deliberate choice to ask a question you think you already know the answer to, and then to actually listen to the response rather than waiting to be confirmed. It requires treating your partner as someone who is still becoming, rather than someone who has already arrived at a fixed form. In practical terms, this looks like specific linguistic shifts. Instead of making statements about your partner, you are asking questions about them. Not rhetorical questions designed to make a point, but genuine ones. What has been on your mind lately that I do not know about? What do you wish I understood about what this period has been like for you? These questions feel awkward in a long marriage, which is precisely why they work. The awkwardness is evidence that you have stopped asking them, and the discomfort of asking them again is the discomfort of re-entering a register of the relationship that has gone quiet, not because it no longer exists, but because it has not been visited in some time. The unspoken grief requires a different move: the willingness to name it, even partially, even imperfectly. Not a full excavation, not a reckoning, just the simple act of saying, there is something I have been carrying that I have not told you about. Something I let go of without telling you. I was letting it go. And I think, if I am honest, that I have been a little sad about it. That sentence, or something like it, is often enough to shift the frequency of a conversation that has been running on logistics for years. Not because it solves anything, but because it reintroduces the emotional register, the one in which two people are actually present to each other, rather than simply managing a shared life. A long marriage is not a finished thing. It is a living conversation that can, at any point, be redirected. The 5 language barriers are real, but none of them are permanent. What makes them feel permanent is the accumulated habit of not addressing them the way silence, over time, comes to feel like the only available language. It is not. The other language is still there. It just requires one of you to speak first. If this opens something in a marriage you thought had gone quiet, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet on this porch, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of conversation we have here. I am Patricia, and I will see you next week.